Chapter 4, Section 3, Persia attacks the Greeks. The Persian Empire. The people of Persia lived in what is today part of the country Iran. They were warriors and nomads. Remember, we talked about nomads earlier in the year. And nomads were people who hunted and gathered for food. They didn't have one particular home. They wandered around place to place. So that's what these people were. The original ancient Persians were warriors and nomads who survived by herding cattle and were used to being dominated by other groups of people. In the 500s BC, a leader named Cyrus the Great brought the Persians together and began to build a large and powerful empire. So if we look over here at the map, on the screen, you can see that the Persian Empire is all of this area that is encompassed in green. So a lot of the places we've talked about so far. Here's Mesopotamia that we talked about in the early chapters of the book, which would be today's Iraq. Over here is the heart of Persia, which would be Iran, the country of Iran today. It even extended over here into Egypt, which we've also talked about. So the Persian Empire was conquering a lot of the places that we are talking about. And we're talking about Greece right now. And so you can see the Persian Empire has come up here right to the edge of Greece, even taking over part of what would be Greece today, northern Greece, but not the main part of the peninsula. The rise of the Persian Empire. Under the rule of Cyrus the Great, the Persians took over Mesopotamia, Asia Minor, Syria, Canaan, and a group of people called the Phoenicians. Now, Cyrus treated the newly conquered people really well, which helped to hold the growing empire together. But later leaders that came after Cyrus continued to grow the empire by conquering Egypt, parts of India, and the Greek region of Thrace. So the empire was getting huge. But in order to keep areas of the huge empire connected, they built a huge network of roads called the Royal Road. So even though they refer to it as the Royal Road, it sounds like a singular thing. It wasn't really one road. It was a whole network of roads that branched off all over the place to connect the different areas of this really large empire. And there's a little quote here on the screen, and a statue of Cyrus the Great says, "Success should always call for showing greater kindness, generosity, and justice. Only people lost in the darkness treat it as an occasion for greater greed." That was Cyrus the Great. It's a pretty powerful quote. It's a quote that I think we should all keep in mind, and anybody that is in charge of people for any reason, I think that this is a good motto to live by. What was the Persian government like? A couple of vocabulary words here first. The first one is satrapies. Satrapies were smaller regions. We would call them provinces that the Persian Empire was divided into. So the Persian Empire, think of that more like a country, and the satrapies would be more like states within that country. So your empire has a ruler, but governors rule over states, just like we're going to have people that rule over the satrapies. A satrap is a government official that ruled over a specific satrapy. So think of a satrap as being like a governor in our situation. King Darius realized that the size of the empire was becoming difficult to manage. So he divided the Persian Empire into 20 satrapies. So you have 20 different satraps ruling over 20 different satrapies so that it would make it easier to manage. Because when you have a giant empire, one emperor or one king over the entire empire isn't going to be able to effectively control things in all these different regions. So putting people in charge of smaller regions to rule on your behalf there is going to make it easier to keep things under control. So the roles that these satraps played, they did things like acted as the tax collector, they were judges, they acted as the chief of police, and they were even army recruiters, recruiting people to serve in the army of the Persians. All of the satraps still answered to the Persian king. He was still in charge, but they were managing the everyday decisions that didn't need somebody from up above to give them their permission. But if it was a really big empire impacting decision, then the king would have to weigh in on that. The king's power in this empire came from his large army of full-time paid professional soldiers. Not every place had full-time paid professional soldiers, but they did, and this gives you a lot of power. If you have a huge army that is well prepared and very committed because they're getting paid to do their job, that gives you a lot of power. And if they are loyal to you, then you have the power of them at your command. The Persian army had a group of 10,000 specially trained soldiers called the Immortals, and their job was to protect the king. So these were 10,000 highly trained, special trained soldiers that basically were the king's personal bodyguards. They were the elite forces in the Persian Empire. The Persian Wars. Greek historian Herodotus wrote the history of the Persian Wars, which is said to be the first real history in civilization. It is because of Herodotus's writing that we know these stories that you're about to hear about the Persian Wars. As we learned before, the Greeks began to set up colonies in the Mediterranean region. Because it was difficult to provide enough food for themselves from just farming and raising animals in Greece because of the difficult terrain, they had to expand their territories and establish colonies in places where they could get food. However, these colonies, setting up all these colonies, often brought those colonists into conflict with the growing empire. So the Greeks had set up a colony somewhere, but the Persians were trying to expand into that area, and that meant that there was going to be conflict amongst them. In 499 BC, the army of Athens helped a group of Greek colonists in what was called Asia Minor at the time. Today it would be the country of Turkey. And the army of Athens helped these Greek colonists to rebel against the Persian rulers. Now, as you might suspect, that doesn't really make the Persians very happy. This rebellion failed, but King Darius, who was the king of the Persians at that time, felt that he's got to teach these Greeks from Athens a lesson about interfering with the mighty Persian Empire. Stay out of our business. We're going to teach you a lesson. So the first battle that is part of this, what we're going to see is a series of battles in what's called the Persian Wars, is the Battle of Marathon. So you can see a little map over here on to the right-hand side of your screen. The Persian fleet of ships landed at the plain of Marathon. A plain is a flat land. We live in plains, so very flat land. So the fleet, as you can see, I'm kind of showing you over here on the side. Here's the Bay of Marathon, a body of water. The Persian fleet is lined up all along here, and they land their ships here, and they unload, and this is where the Persian army gets out, in this large area of flat land. Okay? The Greeks had blocked off access to the passes that would lead the Persians to be able to travel to Athens. So if you see, we have two passes, and here's one. It's like a road that says to Athens, if you're following along with my cursor on the map, and then another pass that would have gone this way. And the Greeks had blocked off access to both ways. Now, what the Persians wanted to do was to march to Athens and basically destroy the city because they wanted to teach the people of Athens a lesson. But they couldn't get there. The Greeks had those passes blocked off. And even though there were more Persians in the army, their army was bigger than the Greeks, the Greeks also had the advantage of controlling the high ground, certain mountainous areas on the sides of the passes. And when you control the high ground, as we've learned before in previous units, that is a huge advantage when it comes to military because it's hard to attack uphill, and you have the advantage of height for launching whatever you're going to launch at them, whether you're using, throwing rocks or rolling things downhill or launching catapults or modern day using cannons. Having height advantage allows you to fire things and shoot them farther. So controlling the high ground was a huge advantage. After a standoff of several days where really nothing was happening, the Persians weren't attacking and the Athenians weren't attacking. The Athenians knew that they didn't dare attack because they were outnumbered. And on flat land, the Persian army was going to wipe them out. The Persians knew that attacking and trying to go through these passes where the Greeks controlled the high ground was going to be a bad thing for them. So it was basically a big game of chicken. So after this standoff of several days, the Persians decided, all right, enough of this. We're going to sail to a different location and attack Athens from a different spot. So they began to load their ships again, which are still parked where they were in the first place. And so they started to load up their ships. And the first group that they would load was the cavalry, the horse-mounted soldiers. And this was a mistake because that was their most powerful weapon. Having the horse-mounted soldiers on flat plains is going to be your best weapon against people in flat land. But they loaded those onto the ships first, probably because they are the most difficult to load. And once they were all on the ships, the Athenians knew, hey, we've got the advantage now, so now is our chance to attack and draw what's left of the army that has not boarded the ships into a battle, and we have a chance of beating them. And they did. This left the Persians weak, and the Greeks were successful in defeating them at this Battle of Marathon. Phidippides. So Phidippides was Athens' best runner. Because they didn't have the types of transportation that we do today, to be able to send messages from place to place very quickly, they had a whole unit, basically, of runners that were part of the army that they would send running to send messages to different places. So Phidippides was the best of this unit of runners. Before the Battle of Marathon, Phidippides was sent to run to Sparta to ask them to send soldiers to help Athens. Now, it turned out that Sparta refused to send soldiers because they were in the middle of some sort of sacred holiday for themselves and they weren't allowed to fight. So that ended up being a waste of his time. Phidippides then ran back to the battlefield. After Athens won the battle, he was sent to run back to Athens to let them know of the victory. And when Phidippides got back to Athens, he said, Nike, which means victory in Greek, and then he died. Now, the myth of this is that he died from running this distance from Athens to Marathon, or from Marathon all the way back to Athens. And that was about 26.2 miles, which is the distance of today's marathon. The race that people run is the marathon, and it is named after this run in honor of Phidippides and what he did. However, it really wasn't just a 26.2 mile long run. He'd really, between running to Sparta and running back to the battlefield and then running back to Athens, it was really about 150 miles total that he had run. I don't know about you, but 26.2 miles is impossible for me to consider. But running 150 miles in a short period of time, over just a few days' time, that definitely had to have taken a toll on his body, and that is probably why he ended up dying. So just remember that. The marathon, the race that people run, about 26.2 miles long, is named after the place where this battle took place and is the distance that Phidippides is estimated to have run back to Athens to declare victory. The Battle of Thermopylae is the next major battle in the Persian Wars. After the Persian defeat at Marathon, King Darius returned to Persia, and he never really recovered from the shame of this loss to the Greeks. And he didn't die immediately, but he didn't live a whole lot of years after that. And he died a humiliated ruler, just kind of a shame. Now his son, Darius' son, Xerxes, becomes the next king. And he vowed to get revenge against the Greeks. Now, revenge is one of the things, but obviously, if you're a king, you going to war and defeating people, you get more than just revenge on your mind. You want to expand your territory. You want to get whatever they've got that's of value. You want the glory of being able to say it. But revenge was definitely a part of this, avenging his father's humiliation by losing to the Greeks at the Battle of Marathon. Xerxes launched an invasion of what's estimated to be 180,000 soldiers and thousands of ships. Now, the numbers are debated a lot amongst historians. Um, there's some wide ranging, but the one thing that all historians agree on is that it was a lot of soldiers, a lot of Persian soldiers, ultimately against not nearly as many Greek soldiers. So whatever the numbers are, the Greeks were definitely going to be outnumbered and at a huge disadvantage. To protect themselves, the Greeks decided to join forces. They were really going after Athens, but the people of Athens were able to convince the other city-states, including Sparta, to join forces with them. Even though they might not have cared about protecting Athens, they knew that, all right, if they go after Athens, the next group they're going to go after is Sparta. So we might as well join forces and try to stop the Persians together now. Spartan king Leonidas brought the most soldiers, and he served as the commander of the army of the Greek forces. Athens is more well known for their strong navy, and so they provided the ships and the navy, which were led by Athenian general Themistocles. Now, at the Battle of Marathon, or preparing for the Battle of Marathon, no, I'm sorry, not Battle of Marathon, the Battle of Thermopylae, Themistocles argued that the best strategy was to attack the Persians' ships and cut off the shipments of food that were supplying the huge Persian army. The Greeks needed time to prepare their ships for battle, so they needed to stall the Persian army before it reached Athens, because that was going to be the next attack. The Greeks decided that the best place to block the Persians was at Thermopylae, which was a narrow passageway in mountains, where on one side was mountains, steep mountains, and on the other side of this pass was the sea. And so if you look at this map over here, you can see here's the Persian camp. They're coming around this way, around this Gulf of Maliakos, and they're going to attack through here. They had to come right through this narrow passageway because there's lots of hills and there's water over here, so this was their best path. But the Spartan soldiers were going to be waiting for them right here where this little green bar is. And that was going to slow them down from being able to get through the passageway very quickly. Now, if you think about it, it's like a funnel or an hourglass with sand flowing through it. There's a lot of sand at the top of an hourglass when you turn it over, but can it all flow through the narrow neck of the hourglass at the same time? No, only a few grains of sand can flow through that neck of the hourglass at a certain amount of time in a certain pace. And so all of the other sand, it will all eventually get through there, but it takes much longer than you might expect. And that's what they were basically hoping to do to the Persian army. You may have a lot more soldiers than us, but if we force you into this funnel, only so many of your soldiers are going to be able to come through it at a certain rate. So we think we're better fighters than you. You have more numbers, but we're better fighters, and we can hold you off or at least slow you down until the Athenians can get their ships ready for battle. So the Battle of Thermopylae continues. So for 2 days, 7,000 Greek soldiers held off the huge Persian army, which, remember, was estimated to be 180,000 soldiers. So 180,000 versus 7,000. And the Greeks are holding them off. They're not allowing them to pass through. They're equal in their attempts in fighting right now. Unfortunately for the Greeks, a traitor gave information to the Persians about a hidden pass through the mountains that allowed the Persians to sneak around from behind. So I'm going to go back to the previous slide here for a second. So this was the path through the narrow passageway, but the traitor told the Persians about this little passageway. If you're following my mouse as I'm drawing on the map, this passageway that winds through the mountains was a secret pass that had the traitor not told them about it, the Persians wouldn't have been able to get through any other way. They would have just continued to battle the Spartans here. But because they could then send some soldiers around to behind, now the Spartans were going to be attacked from the front and from the back. And of course, that was going to be very difficult for them. When Leonidas found out that he had been betrayed, he realized what was about to happen. So he had enough advance warning that before they got surrounded, that he was able to prepare for that. So he decided that he was going to send most of his army back to Greece because he didn't want his entire army of 7,000 soldiers to get wiped out. So he kept only his 300 best soldiers to fight to the very end in this passageway. Leonidas and the 300 soldiers were defeated, but in the end, they fought and fought and fought and successfully held off the Persians for quite a bit of time and had delayed them enough that Athens was able to have prepared their 200 ships for battle against the Persian fleet. So next is the Battle of Salamis. It looks like salamis, but it's not a spicy sausage. It's a Battle of Salamis or Salamis. The Greek fleet of ships were waiting for the Persian fleet in the narrow stretch of water called the Strait of Salamis. So look over here at the map to the right, and you can see this. Here's Athens would be over in this area to the right, and Salamis is this island over here, and the Strait of Salamis. A strait is a narrow passage of water that goes between two bodies of land. Oops. And so the Greek ships were waiting for them here. And they were kind of hidden. You can see them sort of hiding themselves along this passageway. So as the Persian ships came in this way, and the Egyptian ships, which were part of the Persian Empire at that time, were coming this way, the Persians thought that they had them blocked off. However, and the Persians had way more ships than the Greeks did. But because the Greek ships, they're triremes, and here's a little picture of what a trireme is. The way they would fight back then was that they didn't have cannons and gunfire and things like that. They would have to, it was basically a demolition derby with boats. So their boats were designed with these pointy, sharp tips so that they would row real fast into the sides of ships and try to basically sink each other, punch holes in the sides of their ships and sink them that way. And because the Greek ships were smaller, they couldn't do as much damage as the larger Persian ships, but because they could steer more easily and move around a lot more easily, they were able to get a lot more hits in on a Persian ship. And the Persians were just kind of stuck. They couldn't maneuver around in the narrow passageway, which was crowded with ships. You can see in this painting down here kind of just what it looks like. It was very crowded with ships, and the smaller Greek ships did way more damage to the Persians, even though they were outnumbered. And the Greek Navy, despite their disadvantage, was able to easily wipe out almost the entire Persian fleet. So next we go to the Battle of Plataea, and this was going to turn out to be the last battle in the Persian Wars. The Greeks may have wiped out the Persian ships, but the Persian army continued to march on toward Athens. The Persians burned the city of Athens to the ground. But the people of Athens had already fled to safety because the Battle of Thermopylae had slowed things down enough that they gave them enough time to evacuate the city. Now, winter was coming, so Xerxes needed to send most of his army, which was now not going to be able to be easily supplied because the ships had been damaged. So he sent them back home to Persia. But he kept one small group of soldiers that he left in Greece and said, wait out the winter, and basically, when spring arrives, attack and destroy what's left of the Greeks. They thought that they were hiding out, but the Greeks knew that they were there. And so in the spring, the Greeks were prepared for the attack and had put together the largest army that the Greeks had ever assembled as of that date. So the two armies would clash at the Battle of Plataea, but this time the Greeks far outnumbered the Persians and wiped out this small army of Persians that were left behind. So the fall of the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire had some problems before these wars with Greeks, but the Greek defeat of the Persian army just made the problems even worse. The Persian Empire lasted another 150 years after the Battle of Plataea, but the kings that came after Xerxes raised taxes and spent money unwisely, and this made the Persian people angry. At the same time, the royal families were constantly fighting over who should be king. There were constant plots to take over the throne, and 6 of the 9 rulers that came after King Darius were murdered. So it was dangerous to be the ruler of the Persian Empire because there was always going to be somebody that wanted to murder you and try to take over after you. All of these problems together made Persia even weaker and vulnerable to later attacks by the Greeks under a later conqueror named Alexander the Great, who we will talk about later.